I'm John Batchelor. This is The John Batchelor Show. My colleague and co-host, Thaddeus McCotter, joins me from WJR, the great voice of the Great Lakes, and together, Mr. McCotter and myself go to Washington. Francis Rose of Federal News Radio, In Depth with Francis Rose. The Veterans Administration scandal of these last days, with unacceptable stories about veterans waiting, some dying while they're waiting, secret lists, questions about the Veteran Affairs Secretary, Eric Shinseki, whether he should resign, whether the president has confidence in him. Well, that was then. This is now. Today, we're told by the White House spokesperson, Mr. Carney, that Dr. Robert Petzel, who's described as the VA's Undersecretary of Health, has been fired. I believe the word ouster, that's a polite way of saying fired, get out of here, elbowed aside, kicked over the edge. Francis, a very good evening to you. Dr. Robert Petzel, VA's Undersecretary of Health. Mr. Carney is saying that the president regards his exit as holding the VA accountable. Do you go along with this story, Francis? A very good evening to you.
Good evening, John and Thaddeus. Well, it's not a matter of whether I go along with it or not. It's a matter of whether Dr. Petzel goes along with it. And we learned shortly after the news broke Friday afternoon that Dr. Petzel had resigned and that Secretary Shinseki had accepted that resignation, that the media shop for the House Veterans Affairs Committee, Congressman Jeff Miller, let everybody know that Dr. Petzel had already said previously that he was going to retire this summer. And so essentially the case that the House Veterans Affairs Committee was making was, this isn't a resignation, this is just an early retirement. And so therefore, if this is a head that's supposed to roll because of the VA scandal, it's not much of a head because this is a guy who already essentially had one foot out the door.
Thaddeus?
Francis, historically, don't moves like this that appear to be half measures at best or at worst, attempts to just simply deflect blame to bury the issue, these tend to backfire and exacerbate the problem, don't they?
Well, it's hard to say because this VA situation is so profound and means so much to a nation that is extremely sensitive to the care of veterans right now. We have veterans coming home still from Iraq and Afghanistan that are tremendously broken men and women. And the idea that they or their peers who came home from previous wars in the same conditions, or even in milder conditions, would find their care rationed out to the degree that it appears that they were rationed out, at least in Phoenix, and maybe now in other facilities around the country, really, I think, Thaddeus, will respond, the sensitivities of the American people will respond to those developments in ways that I don't think we've seen before.
We've seen the White House defense all weekend. That is, the chief of staff was on, I think, every show I could tune into the last several days, defending General Shinseki, the Secretary of Veterans Affairs. And Eric Shinseki quite clearly has been put at the center of this. The explanation is that he's achieved more, that he's opened up counseling, that he's provided for transparency. There's an investigation underway, and Francis, I'm coming to this story late, so help me. Is it true at this point we don't have all the facts? This investigation that's just started is going to take some time.
Yes, you're correct. We do not have all the facts, and we don't know exactly what is going on. One of the things that is common in a whistleblower case in the federal government is that, as you report often in terms of war, John, the first three reports can sometimes be false. Now, what will happen over the course of the next several weeks and months is that the Department of Veterans Affairs will undergo investigations, no doubt, from the committees of jurisdiction, the House and Senate Veterans Affairs Committee. The VA Inspector General will no doubt take a look at what went on here. But these are not facts that are knowable completely for some period of time. And that's one reasonable and legitimate explanation of why the Department of Veterans Affairs and why the Obama administration would say, well, we're not going to ask anybody to resign today Secretary Shinseki is also known very, very well in Washington for being extremely loyal, sometimes to the point of fault to people who are serving him. Whether or not they're serving him well is often the question, but there are folks in the IT department, for example, who have not served him as well as some would hope, but that he's declined to ask them to leave. So this is a thing that some folks look at in Washington and say this is his Achilles heel, is this loyalty. And so how this will all shake out investigation-wise, there's still a long way to go.
Thaddeus, I call on your experience in Washington. When a scandal like this breaks, and we've had a series of them over these last several years with the Obama administration, the IRS investigation comes to mind when the president also said he was mad. I think the quote is madder than anybody. Is the first instinct in Washington to cover up, to shield people, to not to make decisions, or is the first instinct to haul everybody out and fire them? How do you recall that they counsel you behind closed doors when there's trouble, Thaddeus?
Well, I think they're both essentially the same thing, John. The first goal is CYA.
Right.
So what they can do is they can fire some people quickly. They can pretend that nothing wrong happened. They can call for investigation saying they don't think anything happened. They can be as mad as they want to be. But in the end, it's CYA, and that's why I go back to what Francis said. I think he's absolutely right. The American people are going to continue to be outraged. This is going to be a slow boil, and as more and more find out about it, they're going to be angrier and angrier, which is why the half measure of taking someone who was scheduled to retire and calling it a resignation strikes me as the worst possible attempt to CYA, because it shows the administration realizes there's a problem. It indicates that they don't necessarily want to get to the bottom of it, and they've offered up a medium-sized scapegoat, which is going to exacerbate the situation and make it even harder to get to the bottom of it.
Yes, we're here. We see in the report today, Francis, that the president has not spoken of this for several weeks when he was on the embassy in Asia, and that he will soon address the issue. Has it reached that point in Washington that we need a presidential press conference on this, Francis?
On the Department of Veterans Affairs, it doesn't appear yet, but I would think if revelations come out that other hospitals were essentially cooking the books and creating two sets of books as far as the waiting lists go, then it could get to that level. The part of this that remains to be seen, though, John, is the Department of Veterans Affairs has data that would help clear up the situation with the preventable deaths. Every healthcare system in the United States, every hospital and facility that treats people at the point of death has preventable death cases. We're human beings that are giving this healthcare to other human beings. Mistakes will happen. The issue is a context, and Congressman Miller told me, I can't get those numbers out of the Department of Veterans Affairs. They have to exist. They have to be somewhere within the VA. The question is, if the chairman of the House Veterans Affairs Committee can't get them, who can get them?
Yes, I saw Thaddeus, the Republicans don't need another scandal to beat the drums for the election in November. This seems like that it's going to run for a long time, Thaddeus. This feels like something's been wrong at VA for a long time, and it's going to take a lot of money and a lot of time to fix it.
But it's also going to take a decidedly non-rhetorical approach. There has to be a very calm, very serious, very focused attempt to get to the bottom of what happened and how to fix it. It cannot be played for politics, and I think Representative Miller is a very good person to have this in their hands.
Francis, have you heard anything about a special investigation on the Hill? We know we have one in Benghazi. That's clearly political, but what about this? This could be bipartisan investigation.
I think this will need to play out a little bit longer before they'll go that route, John, but it's certainly not out of the question at this point.
Francis Rose, In Depth with Francis Rose at Federal News Radio. Thaddeus McCotter, WJR, the great voice of the Great Lakes. I'm John Batchelor.